Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. The government's power to see is its power to oppress. The more the state knows about us, the more levers it has to control us. Understanding that connection, its history, and its application is critical if we are to secure our liberties in the face of authoritarian threats, such as the illegal and unconstitutional actions of the federal government in Los Angeles. I'd scheduled this episode with returning guest Patrick Eddington about his new book, The Triumph of Fear: Domestic Surveillance and Political Repression from McKinley to Eisenhower, before ICE set off protests in LA. But what's happening there highlights the need for conversations like the one that follows, because the tools we give the state to protect us are the tools a rogue administration can use to destroy our freedoms. Patrick Eddington is a senior fellow in Homeland Security and Civil Liberties at the Cato Institute. He was formerly a CIA analyst, but left the agency in 1996 after he and his wife Robin, also at the CIA, became whistleblowers, publicly accusing the CIA of hiding evidence that American troops were exposed to Iraqi chemical weapons during the Gulf War. Reimagining Liberty is a listener-supported show. If you'd like to listen to episodes uninterrupted by ads from our sponsors, you can become a supporter. You'll get my newsletter ad-free as well. To learn more, head to www.reimaginingliberty.com. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Pat. How far back does state surveillance in the U.S. go?
I think we can safely say at least as early as the Civil War. And here I'm talking about intercepting telegraph-type communications, but also the use of human spies and things of that nature for gathering intelligence in a military context. But there's also no question you can go back even further than that to basically the pre-Civil War period, that period of time where we see the abolitionist movement really begin to gain steam from the 1830s onward. And you have active attempts by one or more administrations to try to use the Postal Service essentially to shut stuff down, intercepting abolitionist pamphlets and newspapers and all the rest of that and trying to do those kinds of things. So I would say minimally, we could absolutely trace it back to that particular era. But the reason that I subtitled the book Domestic Surveillance and Political Repression is because more often than not, surveillance is the enabler, a major enabler, ultimately, of repression. Because if you're going to target people for more than just keeping tabs on them, you need to gather as much data on them as you can, their associations, their habits, patterns of life, all the rest of that kind of stuff, in order to really, if you're this agent of the state, give you that edge and provide you essentially with the additional information that you need, not just to target that person, but their associates and others. So the surveillance component of this, which for the first several decades of the history of the Republic would have been a male and or human intelligence kind of surveillance, that, of course, in the space of the last 100+ years, has really expanded heavily into the electronic arena. And of course, what we're living with now is insane in terms of the scope of it.
I was going to ask about that we obviously have a lot more surveillance of all of us now than we did at the founding of the Republic. And technology is a huge part of that. They can vacuum up metadata, say like the Snowden revelations from however many years ago. That was long. It was longer ago than I want to think about in terms of me getting older. But and so technology has enabled this. But what I'm curious about is how much the growth in surveillance, and I guess thinking about this, the pivot from state surveillance to the thing that happens to the emergence of a surveillance state, is the result of essentially technology giving them the ability to do it versus them having reasons to want to do it more than they did before, or giving into the urges to do it. So is this there was always kind of bottled up demand and then technology let them fulfill it? Or has the government become more keen on widespread surveillance over time?
Yeah, that's a really good one. The argument that I make in the book is that the overarching mentality behind this is fear. Fear on the part of officials in government, both elected people, presidents, members of their cabinets, all the rest of that kind of thing, and folks in the bureaucracy, whether it was at the Department of Justice or ultimately elsewhere. And certainly in the early 20th century, it was the fear of these new and very, very powerful political ideologies that, of course, manifested first in Europe in the 1840s with those revolutions. And in the decades that followed, those ideas having to do with socialism and communism, anarchism, all the rest of that, they made their way across the Atlantic. And of course, I opened the book with this description of President McKinley being assassinated by a relatively recent anarchist convert. And that is when I really kind of trace the beginnings of the idea of folks in government feeling that there was a need to really expand the power, if you will, of the federal government to go into all these kinds of areas. And this is how we get the Anarchist Exclusion Act of 1903. This is where the government begins essentially to try to use the legislative and executive power to literally censor an entire idea. Now, it was a nonsensical notion, of course, because of newspapers, the telegraph, very, very soon, of course, the telephone, all these kinds of things that make it possible for ideas to spread in a very, very rapid manner. And in the course of the aftermath of McKinley's assassination, we don't just get the Anarchist Exclusion Act, we begin to get a bona fide expansion of the actual human apparatus of surveillance. For most of the history of the country, you didn't have an actual de facto national police force. The Secret Service was the first thing that was really created, and it was initially created to go after counterfeiters, of course, but also to protect the person of the president, and if personnel were available, the vice president, and so on. But by the late 1890s, the Secret Service had gotten into the political surveillance business. A lot of this, of course, happening in the aftermath of the 1886 Haymarket incident in Chicago, which was blamed on anarchists, perhaps falsely, perhaps correctly. The historical record is very mixed in that respect in terms of the data that's available to tell us one way or the other. But what we got by the late 1890s was the Secret Service really getting into spying on anarchist cells on the East Coast, and particularly in the New York and New Jersey areas. Paterson, New Jersey was very much a hotbed of anarchist activity. And so you began to have at least some folks within the Secret Service develop an actual, what we would call today, a subject matter expertise in these groups. And there was one particular Secret Service agent by the name of Moritz Hymans who was so successful at this, he was able to penetrate a number of these anarchist cells and organizations, apparently without ever being detected. That was quite the feat, quite frankly, even back then. But we have the growth after the Secret Service gets involved in doing these things. And President Theodore Roosevelt was an absolute serial abuser of using the Secret Service to spy on his political opponents, whether they were Republicans or Democrats. He was very much an equal opportunity repressor in that respect. But the Congress, the people that were targeted, as well as their colleagues in the House and Senate, never felt they could go after Roosevelt over his misuse of the Secret Service for fear of being essentially labeled as corrupt, as Roosevelt was alleging. Even though these investigations of people like Senator William Borr and others never produced any actual hard evidence that they were, in fact, on the take in any kind of real way. But it was a particular incident in late 1907 involving a Secret Service agent being detailed to the Secretary of the Navy to spy on a particular young man, an ensign by the name of Pritchard, who was being accused of having an extramarital affair. And he was, but that was an incident whereby a Secret Service agent was used to spy on the personal life and habits of a particular individual. It did not remain secret. A particular news outlet got a hold of it. It was publicized. And so then this gives members of Congress the opening to go after Roosevelt, and specifically in early 1908 in the Sundry Civil Service Appropriations Bill to prohibit the use of the Secret Service for anything other than protecting the president and going after counterfeiters. Now, this enraged Roosevelt. He did not veto the bill. Instead, he did an end run and went to his attorney general, Charles Bonaparte, who was in fact a distant relative of Napoleon Bonaparte. And he told Bonaparte to create a fresh cadre of investigators out of whole cloth in the Department of Justice using general funds and put them to work doing exactly what those Secret Service agents had been doing. And in fact, a number of Secret Service agents with experience in political investigations were hired by Bonaparte. And by late 1908, this new creation called the Bureau of Investigation, what we now call today the Federal Bureau of Investigation, by late 1908, that organization was spying on socialists. By early 1909, it was spying on people in the press. So it's the infrastructure, the human and organizational infrastructure, that for the most part comes first. The reliance on technology, or the increased reliance on emerging technologies, that comes with the First World War and the decades that followed.
Does the infrastructure then create a culture, or I guess professionalization create a culture? So let me see if I can tease this out. One of the issues with cops in the US, and the reason cops are the way they are, is because when you're a cop, you primarily hang out with other cops, and you go to cop bars and you're working with cops all day. And I mean, this is the case for any, like you work in public policy in DC, Pat. When I worked there as well, you'd hang out with policy analysts at happy hours. And, this is, everyone hangs out with their professional colleagues a lot. That's not unique. But what happens is you hang out with them, and you have a job where there are dangers involved. Cops do get shot at. They do get attacked. Bad things do happen to them in the line of duty. And you get to where the only other people who understand what it's like or understand the nature of the threats that we deal with are my fellow police officers, which creates a more insular culture because I want to hang out with people who get me and understand what I'm going through. And then you essentially talk yourselves into being more extreme. You don't have the people who are like, wait a second, it's actually more dangerous to be a roofer than it is to be a police officer. The vast majority of people are perfectly peaceful. You just happen to be seeing the ones who are having bad days. And so it creates this culture, and then the culture creates an epistemic bubble where you discount the opinions or the critiques of people outside of it, and you're just hyper-focused on a small set of things. People who work in medicine think that medical issues are the most important issues. People who work in housing policy think that housing policy is the most important thing. Like, you become obsessed with your own profession, which is, again, another entirely natural thing. And so I wonder, to what extent does that play out in surveillance, that it's less about we want to surveil these people because, like, we just want to oppress them. Like, that's the conscious thing. And more when you spend all your day around people who are snooping in order to protect the republic from threats, that's the entire perspective you begin to see the world in. And then it becomes very easy for you to be persuaded, well, there's more threats, or, well, we need to use even more, because you don't have the check that you would if it wasn't professionalized, if you weren't spending all day in it.
I don't think there is any question that the policing profession creates an insularity and a bubble. And one of the things that I've come to understand is that if you were to go to any police academy class, I don't care if it's here in Fairfax County, Virginia, or out where you're living in Denver and Colorado or anywhere else, there is a very, very famous or infamous video that every one of these recruits is going to be shown. I believe it's called the Drinkkeller video, something along those lines. It involves a young, relatively inexperienced officer who makes a stop and is trying to get this individual to cooperate. And this particular male individual is just determined essentially to go well beyond any kind of normal limits. And the young officer lets essentially this guy get the upper hand on him. And the video ends with the young officer being shot to death. I doubt there is any cop in the country who hasn't seen that video. And so to me, what that does, by showing that video, without any other kind of context about the larger life of policing, to borrow a term from Drew Weston, author of The Political Brain, it creates availability bias. It makes that young cop think, oh my God, this is what I'm going to be facing every single day that I'm out there on the street. It's not. That's just not the case. But that's the mentality that is created and it is sustained in these academies. And then after the young recruit gets out there on the road and all the rest of that, living in that bubble with all those other officers just kind of reinforces all of that. I mean, the reality is policing in America is one of the safest professions in terms of annual fatalities and things of that nature that almost anybody can get into. But the police unions would have you believe, and especially unions like the Border Patrol Union, would have you believe that every single cop is under continuous threat and so on and so forth. And the data doesn't bear it out. This is a political problem as much as it is anything else. The problem is that with issues like this, it's almost never whether or not you have facts and reason on your side. It's a question of emotion and perception. And even if those perceptions are completely skewed, it's still what really kind of drives things. And the other thing that drives things is the incentive structure. My wife and I have a young friend who just graduated from the Fairfax County Police Academy last year. He's a great young man. I can already kind of see in my conversations with him some of these kinds of things that are creeping in. I think he'll be stronger at resisting them because I think he's a really smart young man. He has a level of self-awareness that I think most of his peers simply lack. But I've got another friend who is a federal law enforcement officer who I had dinner with over this past weekend. And during the course of our discussion, we got into a chat about the TSA's Quiet Skies program, which Secretary Noem claims has been shut down. And for the benefit of our listeners, the Quiet Skies program is one of those post-9/11 TSA airline passenger surveillance programs. The Boston Globe did a series of damning articles several years ago talking about the number of innocent Americans that got swept up in that program who were denied the right to travel and all the rest of that. And of course, it's only after now the current director of national intelligence, former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, had complained very loudly about being on a Quiet Skies list and all the rest of that, that Noem finally took the action to shut the program down. What she did not shut down was the companion program called Silent Partner, which governs international air travel to and from the United States. So if you are planning on traveling overseas to Europe or Asia or Australia, New Zealand, et cetera, South America, your data may still be swept up in that particular program. So we got into this discussion, and my friend, the federal agent, started talking about the criteria. And I said, yeah, but here's the thing. You're starting with the premise that every American who wants to board an airline is a potential terrorist. And I said, that turns the entire concept of equal justice under law on its head. You know, you're treating that person as a threat first and a citizen very, very distant second. And I could see that they kind of had that deer in headlights look, right? Like they were trying to escape, trying to figure out, how do I get out of this? But in the end, they had to concede my point that the presumption behind this kind of a program is that we're all potential threats, right, to begin with. So that institutional mentality, combined with these policies, combined with incentive structures, helps to drive this. To use just another example, a very, very, well, relatively recent example, but still a post-9/11 one, are the changes that were made to the Attorney General's guidelines for domestic FBI investigations in September of 2008. It was one of the last things that Attorney General Michael Mukasey did before he wound up walking out the door. And what he did is he created an entirely new category of de facto investigations that the FBI could engage in. They're called assessments. And under an assessment, an FBI agent can open a file on you, me, any organization with absolutely no criminal predicate. They can search commercial and classified databases for information about us or any associations we might have. They can target us for physical surveillance. They can target confidential human source recruitments to try to get close to us. And all of this happening essentially without there being any kind of criminal predicate. Now, if you stop and think about it, FBI agents, street cops, whatever, at the end of the day, how do they get promoted? How do they wind up kind of differentiating themselves potentially from their colleagues? Or if there's a specific set of internal criteria that takes you from, I'll just use a federal government term, a GS-12 to a GS-13 in terms of pay and promotion potential. Well, in the case of the FBI, part of that is how many assessments did you write? How many preliminary investigations did you open? How many full investigations did you open? How many enterprise level investigations did you open? How many times were you involved in a raid or an arrest? All the rest of those kinds of things. So it becomes a numbers game. And that was very true of the FBI, extremely true of the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover. He was a fanatic about statistics. Most of them were meaningless. Most of the stuff that they were gathering and trying to measure was ultimately meaningless. But it's those incentive structures that help to drive it. And then finally, I can't let the public off the hook, because the American public, as a general rule, their expectation of cops is get the bad guy, get the bad guy, get the bad guy. It's not, first and foremost, protect rights, protect rights, protect rights. That's just not the message that the average cop gets. So it's a very, very toxic stew that's been created here that helps to fuel all of this.
We're recording this on June 10th. So a few days ago, protests broke out, largely peaceful protests, still largely peaceful protests broke out in Los Angeles as ICE was attempting to kidnap innocent people. And thankfully, Americans seem to think that is still wrong and want to protect members of their community. And the Trump administration has responded to this poorly and in ways that are likely unconstitutional, almost certainly illegal, and are quite troubling from the perspective of the future of American democracy and basic civil liberties and just liberty in general. And you and I had booked this recording before all of this went down. And I had suggested, do we want to pivot to talk about what's happening in Los Angeles, because you were covering it. And you said you thought that it was worth talking about both your book and this in relation to each other. So let's do that. What does your book, which I recommend to all of my listeners, I like a lot of the books that I talk about on this show. This is, I think, the first that I have talked about that I liked enough to have the top blurb on the back cover. So it has my formal written endorsement.
For which I am grateful.
Why did you want to talk about both today?
Well, we are where we are right now in no small measure because of the excesses, the rights violations, the usurpations of the Constitution and other applicable statutes that pretty much all of Mr. Trump's predecessors have engaged in over the course of the history of the Republic. You know, Aaron, as I was kind of thinking about what we were going to be talking about today and what I'd have to say about it, I can only think of two presidents, certainly in the last century, who were not in one way or another responsible for rights violations of American citizens. And the first is Warren Harding, who actually lobbied Congress and was successful in getting the Sedition Act and the Food, Fuel, and Control Act repealed after the end of World War I. He did not manage to get the Espionage Act repealed, unfortunately, or the Trading with the Enemy Act. But Harding at least tried to move the country back in that respect in a more liberty-centric direction. And then the second is the late President Jimmy Carter, who, of course, passed away just within the last year. And Carter, of course, comes into office literally just a year after the Church Committee published its findings about all of the excesses that had occurred in the 50 or so years prior to Carter becoming president. And it was on Carter's watch that he signed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act into law, which was supposed to prevent government surveillance overreach. He signed the Inspector General Act into law. And this is also the period of time in which the House and Senate Intelligence Committees were created. And what we have seen over the course of the last 4 decades is the House and Senate Intelligence Committees mutate from being overseers of the intelligence community and federal law enforcement into cheerleaders. And we, of course, have seen FISA be radically misused, thousands of Americans having their data scooped up, political candidates actually having their donors targeted in the case of one particular House member, 19,000 some odd donors. And then enter Donald Trump, who at this point now in office less than 6 months, has effectively obliterated most of the Inspector General class in Washington, essentially making the Inspector General Act meaningless. And I think that's one of the reasons why the history that I've chronicled, and I'm hardly the only one to have chronicled slices of this history, but why the history of this period, this preceding period, is so incredibly important, because the failure of our system, the failure of members of Congress, particularly the courts have been huge enablers, essentially, of surveillance and police power in general. The failure of our system, essentially, to correct in a meaningful way and help prevent these kinds of abuses is why we are where we are now. You know, Donald Trump was essentially very much at sea during his first term. He was flailing around trying to figure out what to do. This time around, he's actually got a couple of people in his inner circle who know what they're doing. And the two guys at the top of that list, of course, are his shadow, Stephen Miller, who is clearly a white supremacist, in my judgment, and Russell Vogt, who was his director of the Office of Management and Budget the first time around, but who came in with a real game plan this time to just basically gut most of the federal bureaucracy, particularly over at the Department of Justice and especially at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, in what is now, I think, a very clear effort to completely politicize the entire law enforcement apparatus of the federal government to act as really nothing more than Trump's own personal police force. And it's because of all of the failures of the last 60 years to learn from those other overreaches by Trump's predecessors, and the failure to properly put into place really meaningful reforms that would make it impossible for something like this to happen. That's why we are where we are.
If, and this is a huge if, we make it through this, meaning American democracy survives the next 3.5 years and we're able to put Trump and Trumpism in the rearview mirror, does the extremity of what we're seeing now, just the level of abuse that is impossible to ignore because they're so open about it, and so open in their lawlessness and in their willingness to point out that the guardrails weren't really there, that the guardrails that existed before were mere conventions that they could just step over or around or break through. It is basically impossible at this point to be like, this is actually just like normal, people are overreacting and so on. So again, if we can make it through, does that mean we are likely to see a renewed effort at meaningful reform in the same way that the Church Committee happened because there were abuses and the abuses were egregious and Frank Church decided to do something about it, and because the abuses were so egregious, he was able to bring together enough political will to make reforms that did have meaningful effects for a time, even if we then things, they weren't perfect and they didn't last. Do you think we'll see something like another Church Committee, another round of meaningful reforms, given how bad things are now?
We already see some glimmers of that. And I had a recent piece in the Bulwark talking specifically about what needs to come after. And the people right now that appear to be in the early stages of recognizing that we cannot go back to the kind of system we had previously. Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey and Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland appear to be the two guys right now who kind of get this. And I say that because a couple of weeks ago, they introduced identical bills in the House and Senate to move the United States Marshal Service out of the executive branch, move it out of the Department of Justice completely, and put it under the control of the federal judiciary. And of course, this is a response to the almost daily attacks by the president and especially his other mouthpieces, his other amplifiers, enablers, et cetera, on the federal judiciary and on specific judges. And it's a great start. And that's what I said in the Bulwark. But in the end, folks are going to have to realize we have to go much further than that. I see two pathways to achieve that. My ideal pathway would be a constitutional amendment that would take the entire Department of Justice and all federal law enforcement pretty much out of the presidency and would get the presidency out of domestic law enforcement forever. That's a heavier lift, to say the least, particularly in a highly politicized environment. Very, very difficult. My Cato colleague, Mike Fox, has suggested that there is another pathway, one that would not actually require a constitutional amendment, and that would be simply downsizing the Department of Justice and cabining essentially what it can do down to a very, very, very narrow set of actual law enforcement tasks. Probably in a strictly technical sense, the easier lift, but still in this hyper-partisan environment, this hyper-polarized environment that we have, an environment in which, to borrow a line from season 2 of Andor, in which our grasp on reality, or some people's grasp on objective reality, has vanished, has been ripped from their hands, or they've just simply been willing to let it go. We're going to have to get to a place where that is simply not nearly the case with an awful lot of folks in the House and Senate, whether we're talking about the existing composition of the House and Senate or whether we're talking about folks to come. But any kind of effort to rein in this coercive, corrosive surveillance and law enforcement power is going to require an awful lot of people to completely readjust their thinking about the nature of policing and those kinds of powers in America. This fascination with police and this near reverence for police, certainly among the white majority, it's extremely embedded in the culture and in people's mindsets. And that's going to be a tough one. But we don't have any choice but to try, because in my lifetime, I have seen 2 presidents of the United States now successfully subvert the Constitution to meet their political ends. Richard Nixon, if he had not had inept burglars at the Watergate, he might well have gotten away with it completely. His campaign was a political version of the FBI's COINTELPRO. That's literally what it was. Watergate was just kind of the tip of the iceberg. And what Woodward and Bernstein found, of course, in the course of their investigation, was that entire campaign started a year before Watergate. And it was designed essentially to take out the Democrat most likely to have a chance of beating Richard Nixon, and instead let Nixon face somebody who would inevitably be less popular with the American people. And that, of course, is exactly the outcome that Nixon got. Now we have Trump, who, of course, attempted to overthrow the government between November 5th of 2020 and January 6th, 2021, who now has returned to power and is using it on steroids. So I guess the way I look at it, Aaron, is if enough people don't learn the lesson from this and understand that fundamental structural reform, ideally of a constitutional nature, to sharply restrict what a president can actually really do in a domestic context, and specifically that the president should have no role, and the executive branch should have no role at all, really, in domestic law enforcement. Even if we survive this, if the reforms are anemic, if they are inadequate, some other demagogue may well come down the road 20 years from now, 50 years from now, maybe long after you and I are gone, and really succeed, truly succeed, where Trump may ultimately fail. I think the silver lining that we may have right now, at least in part, and you've actually talked about this previously, is the very unstable, fractious nature of this coalition that Trump has put together. And at the macro level, we, of course, have seen that now with the falling out between Elon Musk and Mr. Trump, and how a lot of Trump's mouthpieces, both in administration and outside the administration, are now turning their knives, rhetorical at least, on Musk. And if I were a real cynic, I'd say we ought to be doing everything we can to foster that kind of division, because I think in the end that's part of the solution to actually getting Trump out of power. So I guess my overall message to people is the republic is worth fighting for. And it's always important to remember, and I tell this to anybody who will listen, when you really stop and think about it, America is a miracle. It's a miracle that we were able to achieve our independence from the United Kingdom with a little bit of help from the French government. We beat back a de facto attempted reconquest between 1812 and 1815. We survived our bloodiest war to date, the Civil War. We won 2 world wars. We won the Cold War. Americans invented the light bulb, the airplane, and I'm pretty sure the personal computer. So it really has been an amazing country, despite all these terrible things that I've chronicled and that others have chronicled. And that's why I still believe it's absolutely a country and a republic worth saving. And it's up to each of us, essentially, to do what we can to that end.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Reimagining Liberty. If you'd like to listen to future episodes free of ads and sponsorships, you can become a supporter for just a few dollars a month. Head to www.aaronrosspowell.com to learn more.